And in my job with the Conservancy, I work to protect and restore our freshwater ecosystems for the benefit of both nature and people. What I want to talk to you, as already stated, is that one of the primary benefits that intact freshwater ecosystems can provide for people is indeed flood mitigation. And I'm going to try to pull my viewer away from the screen here, which maybe I'm not going to be able to do. Sorry for the jumping around. Okay, I guess I'm going to ignore that. If you all see that frame in the bottom right of your screen, I apologize. I can't seem to pull that off of there. So I'm going to start with rivers. And in the next few slides, I'm going to try to provide a basic explanation of what shape rivers. So the first thing to know is that scientists and engineers measure the erosive force of rivers as stream power. And stream power is simply a product of the slope and the depth of the channel flow. So the deeper the water, the steeper the channel, the more power, the more erosion. It's really that simple. Okay, so intact rivers have a built-in pressure relief valve to govern the amount of stream power that gets generated during times of high flow. And that pressure relief valve is the floodplain. Where river floodplain systems are intact with low banks connecting the channel bed to the adjacent floodplain, and that floodplain is full of obstructions to water such as trees and dense vegetation such as shrubs, the high flows generated by intense storms or snowmelt flows onto the floodplain where it's slowed and stored for a period of time. In the channel, the energy is governed because the depth of flow is reduced as it spreads onto the floodplain. However, where channels are made deeper, and we'll get to how that happens in a bit, and the banks are higher and actually separate the channel from the floodplain, those same flows generated by intense storms or snowmelt are trapped in the larger channel where they become deeper and deeper, creating more and more stream power, moving at a higher velocity and creating more damage. So really simply, in summary, depth of flow is a direct factor in the generation of stream power and erosion, and floodplains govern depth. This is why you may hear advocates for sound river management talk so much about the importance of river and floodplain connectivity. Okay, so the other factor that I mentioned in stream power, creating stream power, is channel slope, right? As I said, it's depth and slope. So slope is governed by the meandering of the channel or side-to-side movement of the channel over time. So floodplains are the pressure relief valve. Meandering is sort of the thermostat. So as we all know, the steepest path up or down the mountain is the straight one. And if we apply that same logic to rivers, the steepest channel is the straightest channel and the flattest channel is the meandering channel, as I've tried to show on this slide here. So when rivers become sufficiently straight and the slope increases enough to create excessive stream power or erosive energy, the stream begins to meander side to side and it flattens itself and stream power decreases. So that's sort of that thermostat activity that meandering provides. So again, in summary, channel slope is a primary factor in the creation of stream power, and slope is moderated by channel meandering. And this is why it's so important that rivers have room to move side to side across their floodplains over time. Now, humanity hasn't always fully understood how rivers and streams function and what governs stream power. But what we have understood for a long time is that the land adjacent to streams is flat and often fertile, making for excellent travel corridors and areas of development and agricultural production. If only we could keep those channels from flooding and also in a straight and static flow path over time. So around the world and here in Vermont, humans have been endeavoring for centuries to try to maintain straight, steep, and deep channels. And now we get to some of the effects of that. So one thing that we're just figuring out is that when stream power of a river is increased, either by disconnecting the river from its floodplain with berms, as is shown here at this point of the diagram, or disconnected by dredging to keep the channel deeper to contain more water, or straightening the channel to make way for floodplain developments, the river erodes not just laterally or side to side, but more importantly, it erodes downward and creating greater damage. So this graphic is what we refer to as a channel evolution model. It shows the typical way that a channel changes when stream power is increased. And you can see that once a river erodes downward, as in stage 2 of the model, the geeky word for this is incisors, that channel becomes very unstable, right? It's disconnected from that pressure relief valve of the floodplain. Now, the Vermont DEC Rivers Program, ROBS program, has assessed approximately 5,000 river miles across Vermont. And from that assessment, they've learned that approximately 75% of those river miles are in an incised condition. They're very unstable, disconnected from their floodplains. Those assessments also showed that many of Vermont's river miles have been artificially straightened, so they're steeper than they otherwise would be and more erosive. So largely as a result of our historic management, our rivers have become steeper and deeper. Now, skiers might think that's a good thing, but if you're a homeowner, if you're a taxpayer, if you're a manager of a public transportation infrastructure, steeper and deeper river channels are not a good thing. All right, so putting rivers aside for a second and stepping into wetlands, because they are very much an important part of our surface water network when it comes to flood mitigation. So wetlands can occur both next to rivers in floodplains and on hillsides or abandoned terraces. But regardless of where they occur, what they do is act as sinks. They're sinks for flowing water on its way towards our rivers and lakes during precipitation events or snow melt events. They're sinks for sediments and the nutrients that are carried by those sediments. So by trapping flow, wetlands serve as another regulator of stream power and instability. Wetlands store and hold water in their soils, slowly feeding it back to our rivers during drier times, in which aquatic critters need that water. The plants of wetlands also process pollution such as phosphorus, preventing it from reaching our lakes and ponds. We continue to learn more about the economic benefits of wetlands. A study out of UVM's Gund Institute recently showed that the Otter Creek Wetland Complex provides about $126,000 of flood damage reductions to the town of Middlebury every year, and that every acre of wetland provides about $590 worth of flood protection and habitat services annually. With respect to water quality, we've learned that up to 90% of sediment, often containing phosphorus, can be removed by wetlands. And there's also the economic benefits associated with recreational activities such as bird watching. So this is an image of the Otter Creek swamps and a map that shows the town of Middlebury downstream from the city of Rutland. And also in the bottom right corner, a hydrograph showing the amount of flow passing through both of those communities during the Irene flood event. And what the hydrograph shows is that the flow in Rutland, again, upstream of Middlebury, and typically, I think we all understand that the flow typically increases as you move downstream and additional tributaries flow into the main river. So typically, Middlebury, we would expect to have a higher amount of flow moving through Middlebury than we would the upstream community of Rutland. But what the hydrograph here shows from the Irene floods is that approximately half of the flow that went through Rutland did not pass through Middlebury at the same time. The peak is about half of what it was in Rutland. And so where did all that water go? And the answer is that water went into the floodplains and the wetlands surrounding Otter Creek. So this is just an example of how wetlands can provide significant flood mitigation benefits. But just as with rivers, we haven't our historic management approach to wetlands has led to their degradation. According to Vermont DEC, approximately 35% of wetlands have been lost across Vermont, and the total percentage of Vermont now in wetlands is about 4%. So we have straighter, deeper rivers that are disconnected from their floodplains and fewer wetland sinks. We add to that the increasing magnitude of precipitation events associated with climate change And unless we change our management of our freshwater systems, we are in for ever increasing economic loss and human suffering associated with flooding. And I'm going to wrap up with just 2 slides showing some of the work we've done. So in our work, we're working with partners to protect and restore river corridors from encroachment so that they can be allowed to meander, moderating their slope and erosive energy. This slide shows a map of one such project in which we're able to contribute along the Missisquoi River in Weston, which included the protection of 200 acres of river corridor, including 65 acres of wetland protected by a conservation easement. And finally, this slide shows a project we're participating in the town of Huntington. This is a neighborhood in the town of Huntington along the Huntington River, which suffered severe flood damages during the Halloween storm of 2019. This is a repeated flood damage site, and we're working with our federal and state partners to bring the approximately $1.5 million needed to buy out these homes so these families don't have to live in constant fear of the next flood, and the river can regain access to the floodplain, providing flood mitigation benefits downstream. So adaptive relocation from flood hazards in Vermont is as important as adaptive relocation from wildlife hazards in California, but we don't necessarily have the funding on hand to be able to act quickly to help homeowners make the difficult move from a place they may love but have come to accept as unsafe. So in just closing, along with funding to mitigate existing flood hazards, we need continued leadership, additional policy, and enhanced regulations to prevent future encroachments into our floodplains and wetlands so that our natural infrastructure is fully functional and able to support resilient communities. And thank you.
Thank you, Shayne.
Thank you, Representative Dolan, for inviting us to come and talk to this group and for me to talk about flood risk in Vermont. We don't have much time and it's a big topic, so let's get into it. Somebody could turn off their mic. I'm getting some feedback.
Yes, Scott, that's you, I think.
Let's remind ourselves that we are the Green Mountain State and we are a wet climate. And so when we get excess precipitation, it runs off our landscape in a hurry, typically in the form of a flash flood. Lots of stream power, as Shayne said. I think everybody's familiar with this trend, which is increasing annual precipitation, or if you want to look at it through the lens of extreme precipitation or heavy downpours, we're seeing in the Northeast a 55% increase over almost 6 decades. And we expect that trend to continue as we have less water locked up in ice and being pumped around the globe by warmer temperatures. When we think of federal disaster declarations, flooding predominates. We've received 34 declarations related to flooding in the last 30 years, 12 in the 9 years since Irene. This is kind of steady state for us now. We're always in some mode of flood recovery and preparing for the next flood. When we think of flood hazards, we commonly think of flood inundation, what's underwater during a particular flood event. And we have federal flood hazard maps as shown in the lower left here with this red polygon in Waterbury depicting the nature of inundation hazards. In many areas, including Waterbury, the inundation maps do a reasonably good job of showing what's underwater during a large flood. However, these inundation flood hazard maps are not enough. They really underrepresent flood risk. Shayne mentioned that we have a lot of our rivers, 3/4 of them, that are disconnected from their floodplains due to historic channelization practices. That's the case here on the Browns River in Underhill. FEMA mapped the inundation hazards 10 years ago. They did a restudy, remapping effort. And as you can see, the river is already adjusting outside of the mapped flood hazard area. So we need other tools besides these maps. And again, worth reminding and reinforcing Shayne's points, rivers are naturally dynamic. They change location in river bottoms over time as they move and deposit sediment. That's a normal, predictable process, and it gets worse when we channelize rivers. It exacerbates and accelerates that process. And this is what happens when we put our investments in these dynamic river environments. This is what it looks like. You've seen some of these pictures probably in other presentations or in the media. You know, nature bats last, as Bob Irwin from American Rivers poignantly says. And of course, I'd be remiss if I left out the fact that our transportation infrastructure is really our most frequent and costly damage in Vermont, kind of year in, year out. You know, or as we all drive on our road systems, they're co-located in river valleys. They, by necessity, have to cross rivers and streams. So let's quickly shift gears to flood resilience strategies. You know, here's a list. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's a list of a lot of activity being done by a number of partners in the state, private and public sector. I don't have time to touch on all of them today, but I will highlight a few of them as shown here. River corridor mapping with new authorities coming out of the legislature in 2012 after Irene by way of Act 138. We endeavored in my program to create a statewide river corridor map layer. That was completed in 2015 and updated with field data in 2019. And it really factors the dynamic nature of rivers into planning and regulation. It doesn't really, you know, the river corridor as shown here doesn't depict what's underwater during a particular flood event, though it may be depending on the size of the flood and the condition of the river. What it's really defining is that the minimum valley space the river needs over time to be least erosive as it adjusts and moves sediment and deposits sediment. So important for siting new development and knowing where to put it and not put it. Going back to our Browns River example, again, this is textbook extreme example, but it exists on many rivers in Vermont. The river corridor is 3 to 4 times as wide as the inundation floodplain. So really an important tool, and really, you know, what we've tried to do and really scale up over the last 10 years is managing our rivers and floodplains in consideration of inundation hazards and erosion hazards. When we flip over to the land use regulation, in Vermont, it's really a patchwork. We have municipal permits, usually through adopted hazard bylaws and issued as a zoning permit. We have our state land use permit, Act 250, and review under the floodways criterion. And then lastly, what came online most recently is the state flood hazard area and river corridor rule. That regulates a subset of activities that towns are not allowed to regulate, such as required agricultural practices and state buildings and facilities. With all of these authorities, we're really trying to implement a set of avoidance strategies and no adverse impact standards. We're explicitly doing that with our state authorities. We recommend and encourage towns to do that through our state model bylaws. The state model bylaws, we through the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund have created financial incentives for towns to adopt those higher standards. And so over the last 10 years, we've got about, I believe at last count, it's 99 communities have some combination of higher standards on the books. And 50 of those communities are regulating river corridors for some or all of their rivers and streams in consideration of those erosion hazards. Again, as a legislative directive after Irene, we stood up the Rivers and Roads Training Program in partnership with VTrans and Department of Fish and Wildlife to enhance municipal cooperation and interagency coordination, and really to ensure that when practitioners are doing work either before the flood or after the flood to rebuild, replace our transportation infrastructure, it's done in a way that is as compatible as possible with river dynamics. Thinking of outreach and tools with some FEMA funding post-Irene, we were able to stand up the Flood Ready website, which is really geared at citizens and municipal officials trying to explore all their options in enhancing resilience in their town. This is information dense. I encourage you to check it out if you have not. We also created with EPA Lake Champlain Basin Program funding a companion website called the Flood Training website. This is geared at administrative officials, zoning administrators, those folks that are really in the trenches trying to administer hazard bylaws locally. and give them the tools and education they need. I really encourage you to take some time, if you can, look at the case studies section. There are some really good videos highlighting a number of communities, really showing what's possible and what's being done in small town Vermont in partnership, with towns, the state, the private sector, and regional planning commissions. And closing in on it here, I really like this graphic created by our colleagues at the Department of Housing and Community Development, because it really frames kind of how to think about where we focus our energies and attention in dialing up our work to improve our adaptation and resilience, whether we're looking at hardening and mitigating our investments in vulnerable existing settlements, citing new development in smart, safe places, and where we're really protecting our macro scale green infrastructure up and downstream of our existing settlements to protect wetland and floodplain functions, and really turn those and ensure that those are more assets than they are liability. I like to layer on that our challenge is managing the unavoidable and avoiding the unmanageable. That was a title of a climate paper from 2007 that really frames it succinctly. And then lastly, I guess maybe as a prompt for some questions here in terms of some of the stuff Shayne and I just went through in lightning round fashion, I think there's various arenas for which we can think of opportunities and room for improvement, because our work is not done. So with that, I'm done. Shayne and I can take questions.